And we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of A Bookish Moment. I am one of your hosts, Sarah Burr.
And I'm one of your other hosts, JC Kenny. And Sarah, I am cold here. It's like 0 degrees in Indianapolis. And I think the best way to get warm is to talk books. So I think it's time to get bookish.
I couldn't agree more. It is freezing here as well. We had a mishap with our heat yesterday, which resulted in us not having heat for for a very long time. So I'm glad that things are back to normal, and we're going to have a very cozy afternoon, and really excited to chat with our guest today, Sandra Gurvis. Sandra, welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you. Hello. Thank you for having me.
We're really excited for you to be here because, and for our viewers who are joining us live, Sandra is one of our first nonfiction authors to join us.
Yes.
And we are going to be talking about Sandra's latest piece in a very long line of prolific work. You have so many books that we could discuss, but today we are going to be showcasing the Three Ringling Circus, which I'm really excited to dive into from a historical standpoint because I actually spent a lot of my childhood in Florida. I was out on the Panhandle area, so not so close to Sarasota, but I always love hearing and learning about just the world that we all have come from. So Sandra, do you mind just first telling us a little bit about yourself and your career and kind of what brought you to be a writer?
Wow, that goes back a very long way. So, and that would take way too much time, but essentially I've been a writer for over 40 years. And my first book that was commercially published, I've had 18 commercially published books, but the first one I did was like in the early 90s. It was about all these small museums in the United States, and it was called 101 a Cockroach Hall of Fame and 101 other off-the-wall museums. I was very unhappy. I took myself very seriously, and I did not want to be known as the author of the cockroach book, which got me on Good Morning America and got me on this was a long time ago, this is like in the 90s, in every major newspaper and in National Enquirer. So that's, so this is kind of an offshoot of that. I like to write about the quirky and the offbeat. I'm not afraid to dive into things head first, which just gets me in trouble because I end up taking forever to write the book. Either it's fiction or nonfiction. And the reason I wrote this book is because I moved to Florida in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, the June of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. And the biggest museum, one of the biggest museums in the country is in Florida, Sarasota. I moved to Sarasota. Was the Ringling. And I thought, oh, I like that. I kind of going back to the first thing I wrote about, the museum book. And I liked that. And I also started reading a little bit about the Ringlings, and I liked the family. I liked everything they stood for. I thought they were honest, hardworking people, not, people who were, robber baron type people. I'm not fond of those, although John definitely had some robber baron tendencies. I mean, he was no angel. But, and I just, had written several books for this publisher, Ohio Travel Books. And the book I did before this one that did pretty well was called Myths and Mysteries of Ohio, which is like 13, unusual stories in Ohio. And it did pretty well. And so they said, sure. And I'm like, oh, now I have to write it. So that's essentially it in a nutshell without me taking 3 hours to explain the whole thing. So,
well, that really actually leads nicely to my first question for you, because in the intro for the book, in the acknowledgement section, you say writing a nonfiction historical book is like dealing with a tsunami without a team of first responders. So what I would love to know is, once you decided like, hey, I would like to write a book about this, how do you begin to put together a work of nonfiction in a way that is both informative but also engaging for the reader?
Well, that's like, it's kind of funny because, when I start, I have a process essentially, usually now, not with this newest novel, but in general in the past and with nonfiction books, I do an outline. Not a detailed outline, but I sat down and I kind of drilled down what are the three most important things about this book and what is not been explored so much in nonfiction, because you can, like with the Mysteries book and a couple of the other Ohio books, there have been so many books written about it. So I made it a point to dig down a little farther and find the things that people didn't know. And it wasn't so much apparent with this book, but because what had been written, one was very historical, every piece of paper John Ringling ever touched. It was extremely well researched. It was one of the first, books, major books that I used. The other was kind of a couple of romantic family tales written from family members. The other was A History of Sarasota by John Grismer, who was like this amazing writer. And this book was published in 1947. So I start out with these three books. And the thing of it is, I try to, it's hard to, I have this obsession with being right all the time, which is really bad when you're a writer, because there's so much information. So essentially, I just went through every piece, went through the books, learned about the aspects, went to the archives in the Ringling many times. I always tell people I, came for the information and stayed for the cat stories, because the archivist ended up being a friend of mine. She was a cat lover, as I am, and gossip about John Ringling and Mabel Ringling, and we stayed for that. And I don't know, I can't count how many times I spent at the Ringling archives, the internet and libraries, Manatee libraries. And I just kind of took everything piece by piece and step by step. I had my three aspects of, this history of Sarasota, the story of the Ringling family, and then how the Ringling Museum and the Kadazan, which is John's house, came about and what Sarasota is like today. So I was able to focus that. I found a lot of discrepancies, and I tried to just cover all of those. But I also realized that I'm always going to miss something, as hard as I try. And so I think by taking it step by step, chapter by chapter, that is essentially how I did it. And it took me a very long time. They wanted it much sooner than they got it. And they were like threatening me towards the end. Oh boy. Not threatening me, but they're like, look, you better have it in by this date, or okay.
Well, because I can imagine that it's hard to, and thinking from how JC and I approach writing from a mystery fiction standpoint. And, I'm at the point right now in one of my own books where I'm trying to get everything to line up so that the mystery really clicks into place. And I can imagine that you experience kind of similar challenges in nonfiction, because you have all this information that is at your fingertips. But what happens when something else is this book was just discovered, or a new source comes to light, and you have to kind of juggle all of those aspects?
Yeah, I just do. That doesn't happen, too often. This is history. This is stuff in the past. It's not quite as you're doing something current. If you're doing something current, that's a little different. The point is that when I'm dealing with reams of facts, numbers, and figures from this one book, some of this stuff was so encyclopedic and so detailed. Each painting that John Ringling bought, how much he paid, his interest, in terms of what types of things he owned, that stuff, I would read that and think, and there were a couple histories of Florida and Sarasota that I experienced where they went into such detail about each battle and each that. And I'm like, but this is not, and then I would tell myself, stop. Is this what you want to read? Would you spend hours reading this? I'm like, no, I want to read the good stuff. I want to read the, factual, but interesting. So that helped a lot. So fiction and nonfiction, it's weird because I used to approach both, as I had two novels published, approach them pretty much the same. But now that I'm dipping my toe into the mystery genre, that's a whole other animal. So it's just different, but yet it's the same because you really have to base it in some sort of reality. It has to be steeped in authenticity, I guess is how I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and one of the things I find fascinating when reading nonfiction is I think of, and to your point, Sandra, for example, Team of Rivals, the story that the book that Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote about Abraham Lincoln and putting his cabinet together after he was elected president, and how it's so easy to. Boy, I'm being really articulate here, aren't I? I guess the question is, what approach do you take, or how do you decide what to use in a story about, or in a book about, the Ringling Brothers,
right?
Super famous folks, and have it engaging, entertaining, keeping it factual without having it turn into a textbook? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And that's what I was actually talking about, is the fact that, I had to, I can be very intimidated by other people's writing, like I said, some of this stuff is so encyclopedic. So I would just sit down and just try to figure out the things that interested me most as a reader. And I would have to ferret that out. And then, a lot of times, I don't know how the writing process is for you, but it just seems like if I can get myself into that flow, then it just comes together. It just comes together. And it's something like you asked me about something new coming up. And if that something new comes up, I'm like, oh dear. And then I think about it and I'm like, oh, it'll fit here. So that is essentially it. It's a mystical process for me. I don't think I could quite describe it. People say people who are writers, they sit around do nothing all day, which is kind of true. Like, I'll sit down. I have things to do, and then I look up and they're done. It's not quite like that, but it's kind of an interesting process. I just think it's about immersing yourself in the subject and losing your sense of self-consciousness and letting the subject take a hold of you. And then you just express it. And a lot of times I think, oh God, this is not what I want to say. I'm like, well, I can always fix it. I can always edit it. And that's the cool thing about it. So that you can always go back and revise it a little bit.
Yes.
So
thank goodness for editors.
Thank goodness, because there are some things like, wow, I can't believe that I wrote it like that.
Yeah, or tight proofreaders. Yeah.
So Sandra, you had mentioned when you have those moments of, this isn't, you're reading and you're learning all of this information and you're like, well, this isn't I want to give the entertainment. I want to give stuff that, people are going to be hooked by. Are there some favorite little tidbits from Three Ringling Circus that you want to share with our readers that you think may catch their eye or catch their ear to learn more?
Yeah, I think the thing that I embraced, which, is I went for the realistic stuff. Like a lot of times people would Fernando de Soto, for example. I'll get to John Ringling in a minute. Everything around here is de Soto, and I'm speaking at the bookstore tomorrow. And the little excerpt I'm going to read it's called "Those Mean Spaniards." So that kind of sums up what I do, and it's kind of scary these days because of some of the censorship that's going on. But I tell myself, these people were people, they made mistakes. John Ringling was a very enigmatic character, and yet I felt connected to him because he was very honest, and he was very stubborn, two traits that I probably have. And he tried to do the best, and he loved the circus. And I just kind of, found him to be a relatable person. He married later in life. He and his wife, first wife, Mabel, they were very happy. He loved art. He loved the beautiful things, and he brought it back for the world to share. He wasn't really a team player with regard to his family because he was smart. I mean, he had an amazing, acute sense of business. He didn't just make his money in the circus. He made his money in the railroads and in steel and all the things like that. And he was an astute businessman. He was not afraid to go after things, which is a good hallmark of success. So he didn't exactly win popularity contests. His brother Charles, and John and Charles always had a little rivalry going. Monetarily, John had no equal with regard to that. But Charles was more of the people person. They called him Mr. Charlie in the circus. His wife Edith was beloved in the circus, and they were close but not close. And they had tried to have a united front, and they didn't exactly agree on anything. And the latter chapter of John's life was very sad. His wife passed away after they finally built Cottazon, and they were living the Gatsby type 1920s life. And you go to Cottazon, and it is just, especially on a beautiful day, it is like, that place is one of the most beautiful places on earth. It just is. The whole museum and complex are amazing. But the last part of John's life, his wife passed away and he remarried too quickly. And, the second wife was kind of maligned in the press, and she really wasn't as bad, because the archivist that I mentioned before, she was so amazing, and I thanked her. She was so amazing in terms of steering me to certain things for my research. And, he lost everything. He lost his circus, he lost his health, he got divorced. And by the end, and the last chapter that I wrote, it was called The Last Parade, and his nephew, I think it was his nephew, wrote it. I excerpted part of it. And by the time I finished it, and I even talk about it now, I get teared up. And I'm like, this guy died almost 100 years ago, and yet I feel a kinship to him. And I felt that, and I'm hoping the people that read this feel that too, that it makes it come alive, and you can just inundate people with facts and figures, or you can focus on the humanity of people and do the best you can, because nothing is, so hopefully that answers your question.
Well, yeah. And I think it really speaks to the passion that you've put into this work, that it brings that type of emotion to you as the writer, and having those connections with a family that, you've learned and gotten to know through the pages of history. So I think that's really moving.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. It's just, and also because this is a smaller city than other places. I lived in Ohio my whole life until 4 years ago when I moved down here. And yeah, it will be 4 years in June. And I grew up in Dayton, which was kind of a small cultured town. And then after I graduated college, I moved to Columbus and lived there for like a very long time. So when I first thought of moving to Sarasota, I thought, it's like Columbus with an ocean, because it was like, but when I moved here, it was more like Dayton with an ocean. It's much smaller. Even the downtown is small. And the area is big and the area is growing. When I first came down here, it was kind of a funky, artsy place. And it's still that, but it's kind of moving away from that. But we went to the Ringling Museum New Year's Day weekend, and my friend and I, we got there about 11, and we stayed a few hours, and by the time we were walking out the door, it must have been closer to, there was a line out the door of that museum. There were 40 people deep, and I'm like, whoa, the gift shop better be starting to sell my book pretty darn soon. That's all I have to say about that.
Now we do have a question from one of our viewers in chat, asking us if any of us were ever lucky enough to see the Ringling Brothers Circus.
I'm trying to remember. I don't remember. I went to the circus as a child, but I don't know if it was Ringling Brothers. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I think the circus is actually, this is not related to the question, but they are bringing it back.
Mm-hmm.
It's Feld Entertainment now, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it was just relaunched again, but without the elephants. Now, when I was a kid, I went to the circus and I saw the elephants and all that. And I really liked it, and the performers especially. But no, I went to the circus and I loved it, but I don't know which one it was. So
I'm trying to remember if I definitely saw a really, really big circus at one point in my childhood, but I don't remember if it was Barnum or Ringling.
Well, they were one and the same, actually. they emerged, I think, in the 30s, maybe before that.
Oh,
Yeah, they were all one circus. If you saw Barnum and Bailey, you saw Ringling.
gotcha.
They were one and the same. But there was a lot of smaller circuses too. So, but it's,
Oh, I was just going to say, I remember I got to see one of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circuses when I was a kid. And then I remember taking my kids to the Shrine Circus. So that was one of the smaller ones.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but yeah, that great memories. And Sandra, I just want to mention that, yeah, we just saw an ad here for in Indianapolis. The new version of the circus is going to be here in Indianapolis soon. And it's a lot of stunts and things like that. So it kind of reminds me of, instead of the animals, you're going to still see like the traditional trapeze artists and a lot of those great traditional circus things, but also like a lot of the death-defying acts like you see on America's Got Talent, kind of was the impression that I got.
And I mean, the thing about the animals, I mean, I love animals. My cat, he's behind the thing. I should bring him out, but I'm not going to. I would want to be. But I love animals. I've always loved animals. And they were really good to their animals. At least the Ringlings were. One of the things you asked me about a myth, and it's just popped in my head. One of the myths I encountered was that John Ringling used elephants to build the Ringling, the bridge and St. Armand's. You know, he did not use elephants. He was a Republican. They wanted him to bring an elephant to the Republican convention. He would not do that. Oh, elephants were expensive. They were delicate. All those animals had to be cared for really, really well, because you don't want some beaten up, terrified creature, you know, performing. And I'm not saying one way or the other, but there is that. So, you know, and they did have quite a few animals, and some of the tales during the early days before trains, where they would go from one place to the next, and they'd be dragging the circus from, I mean, that sounds so, you know, oh, when you're a kid, I'm going to run away and join the circus. Well, guess what? If you were a kid in the mid-1800s, like the Ringling boys were, and they fell in love with it when they were kids and they put on their own circuses, that would involve sleeping in flea bag hotels, performing for 2 hours one night, and you're tired from performing, but no, you got to pick everything up and drag it to the next city. And that could be rain, snow, sleet, hail, whatever. So running away to the circus, when you actually think about it, was maybe not such a great option.
Well, we do have a few folks that are chiming in about when they were, when they had seen the circus themselves. We have Farmhouse Reader had seen one in Philadelphia. And then we have David, who saw the pre-fire B&B around 1946. So we've got a lot of circus folks who've enjoyed the circus joining us this afternoon. Cool. So that's exciting. Now, looking at our time, Sandra, I told you it was going to fly by. We've got about 5 minutes
and
left.
You guys were great.
We've got about 5 minutes left of our moment together. Okay. But I wanted to ask you about what project you had mentioned that you are kind of, you're beginning to write a mystery. Tell us a little bit about what you have going on.
Okay. So now, you know, I'm not exactly a spring chicken. And so I sat down and I made some decisions. And I mean, I'm not adverse to writing another nonfiction book, depending on how much monetary is involved. But while I'm not doing that, and while I'm doing my other freelance work, because I do freelance writing, is I started a mystery novel about the villages. It's a satire mystery novel about the villages. It's called Doing Hard Time in Geezerville. I can say that because I'm that age and you can't yell at me. It's just, it's about a woman who's a paramedic, and she kind of loses everything, and she inherits her uncle's house in the villages, and she's 55, so she can move down there. And essentially, it's her adventures and misadventures. I am essentially flying without a flight plan here with this book. I had an idea. I mean, I get these ideas, and they're like in my head, and I'm like, how am I going to do that? And then it happens, and I'm like, oh. And I do kind of have an idea. But it's just, and there's so much material. There's so much material. I have enough for 10 books, but I'm actually already planning a series of 3. And, you know, oddly enough, I do understand the appeal of the villages because I actually went there and spent quite a bit of time there and interviewed people there. So I'm hoping that the readers there will be people from the villages who won't want to come after me with pitchforks and whatever those things are, with the lighting, the lamp or whatever those things are, because we do not want angry villagers at my door. So I want them to be entertained. But, you know, there's an awful lot of good material. And, you know, and I had to learn a lot. I mean, it's a completely different genre. I went to Sleuth Fest. I learned about forensics a little bit, about crime writing, about, you know, I kind of studied the genre, read a lot of fiction, you know, and as a writer, we need to read and really familiarize, no matter what writing you want to do. The first thing you got to do is, you may think that you're going to reinvent it, but you go through life and you realize the best thing you can do is learn from somebody else and then put your own spin on it. So I think that's essentially the book.
Well, it sounds like it'll be a really fun ride. And I think that that's a great piece of writing advice, though, for any aspiring writers or authors that are out there. You know, I think it is really smart to understand the genre that you're working in so that you can bring, you know, elements of new and fresh perspective to the genre, but you're also going to want to appeal to those folks that, like, we love when you know, when people follow the same formula over and over again, like that's what they're there to read. So knowing how to kind of marry those two together, I think is always a really, it's a hard hurdle to overcome when you're first starting out. So I'm glad it seems like you know it already. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I try to write what I would enjoy reading and what I think other people who like the same things I do enjoy reading, which isn't the whole world, but, you know, hopefully there are a few of those out there. So,
yeah. You know, with only a couple minutes to go, Sandra, I guess one of the things I would like to circle back real quick with regarding your new book, and why don't you show it to everybody again so they can see it, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Here it is. Talk about it. Three Ringling Circus. That's a gorgeous cover. Is there any one thing in particular you want readers to take away from that book that you'd like people to know about?
Well, a couple of things. I think that one thing we all need to understand is that history tends to repeat itself, and people think that history is dry and boring. And the more you read it, the more you realize that it is about people, it's about their stories, it is about their suffering and their triumphs. Okay, so it's not those people in this book are long gone, but they're just like you and me. And I think that's a hard lesson for especially someone really young to learn. And I wanted just people to understand that what happened in Sarasota, how it came about. I hope to shed a little, you know, more insight into the history of Florida. I mean, I'm new to Florida, and I know that, and that's why I got papers and, you know, original documents to try to learn as much as I could. And I just wanted to make it an interesting story, maybe not a novelesque or whatever the word is, but I wanted to put it together in such a way that people would enjoy reading it and they would learn something, and a little bit about art and culture too, which is very important to us.
Yeah, and
hopefully that answers the question.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. Yeah,
that's a beautiful way to encapsulate what you've done with the book. And so, what are as we kind of wrap up, are you doing any in-person events? Any?
Oh yes.
Any
I'm going to be.
People can kind of connect with you.
Well, it's mostly in Florida. I'm going to be at Sarasota Bookstore 1. I'm tomorrow, and then I'm going to be at go on my website, www.sandragurvis, my full name.com, and there's a section that says speeches and workshops, and all my stuff is on there. And I'm just going to be doing some things at the Manatee County Libraries because I live essentially in Bradenton. And I'm also going to be doing something at the Lee County Library, which is over at Fort Myers. I'm going to be at on a panel in the Venice Book Fair, Venice, Florida, not Venice. Book Fair, and I'm hoping to go. I'm going to Ohio for a week, and I'm hoping to be at the Ohio Anna Book Fair there. I haven't heard yet, but they better. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. I've been at the book fair before a lot of times, so excellent. I mean, they know I'm kidding, right?
We can always scrub it out.
Ah, that's okay.
Well, Sandra,
They know me. This is nothing. They're used to me. So okay.
Well, it's really been a delight getting to know you and to learn more about your work.
Yeah, thank you. It was great talking to you guys. You were so much fun.
Oh, well, thank you. And we appreciate you sharing your time with us this afternoon. And to our viewers who joined us live, thank you for being here. We always appreciate your comments and your enthusiasm. Folks, you heard Sandra. Go to her website, www.sandragurvis.com, to learn more about her workshops, to connect with her, and to stay up to date with everything she has going on. And Sandra, I hope when your mystery comes out that you'll come back and join us so we can chat about it.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Everybody, have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. And until we see you again, stay bookish. Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.